Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Faith Forum, A Life of Liberation, Remembering Gustavo Gutiérrez, presented by the Wake Forest University School of Divinity in partnership with our colleagues in Latin American Studies, as well as our colleagues in the Department for the Study of Religion. We're going to begin tonight's program with a film, and part of the film this film will show Gustavo Gutiérrez reflecting on the history and origins of liberation theology and his place within that history.
Well, and about the birth of one new theology, new is too much to say. Same themes and points, but from other points of view. And do you know how many theologies are in the history of the church? I don't know. But you know, it's many. And the big theologies, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, are present until now, and others also. And the other, well, are the theologies of reflection, very linked to the time and for the questions present in one moment. It is the case of liberation theology also. Some circumstances were present in 50 years ago, more or less. Very difficult to put dates, in these questions. And I think this theological perspective is the result of, three factors, three movements. The first one is historical, and is the new presence of the poor in our world, in humanity. The presence of the poor beginning probably 19th century, a little more 20, and so, but clearly in the middle of 20th century was very strong, was the beginning. One example is, or symbol of this was called the meeting in Bandung, Indonesia. It was a meeting of the poor countries, Asian and African countries, not Latin Americans in the first meeting, but after that, several Latin American and Caribbean countries were in the same way incorporated in this. This Bandung was 1956. Was for the interesting in intelligent persons, it's something very important. For the first time, the poor countries, for this reason, their association in one moment was the expression also the third world, because not capitalist, not a communist, it was the idea, and a third world. Today we have only two, because in Latin America is part of the second world. It's the only one promotion in so many years, because third two. But the situation is not the same, but it's always difficult. Well, and I remember in the council, Elder Camara, you know this name, the Archbishop of Recife, a great personality. In one moment, he was speaking about we need a Christian Bandung. One manner to speak, but was very present in many other things about this. And we have also the decolonization of so many countries, Asia, Africa, Caribbean also, in Latin America, or at least in this continent, and new presence in different manners, ways. It is not a question only in our continent, in Latin America and the Caribbean, but was present also in the world, in other countries. You know this in this country, who is the black movement and black theology, more or less in the same dates, and or the movement of women, the other expressions, and you know, I don't pretend this take too much time. I don't pretend to detail this, but certainly it was present in the world, above all in the poor countries, and in the minorities, the case of Blake, the black people. Well, and we call this in Latin America also. We have called this the eruption of the poor. The poor was so present, and because historically they were absent of history, absent. And they were there physically, but they were not subjects of their destiny. For example, even today, are not fully, at least. Well, this eruption of the poor, this is an ongoing process. It's not finished. It has started more or less in the first part of the 20th century, above all in the second part of the 20th century, even more and more. We have today other expressions of the presence of the marginalized people. And well, this movement put several questions to the announce of the gospel. This question is not only political or social. Our vision of this situation, new situation, was to say we need to reflect about the Christian message. This is theology. Theology, we are going to the sources in order to answer the fights, the challenges. This is the case. And well, it was very important even today.
I know we can sit here all night and listen to the words of Gustavo Gutiérrez and his reflections on a truly planetary life of liberation and a planetary vision. He has set the agenda for us in so many ways. And on the first page of his classic text, A Theology of Liberation, he sets the intellectual agenda when he writes, "Our purpose is not to elaborate an ideology to justify postures already taken, nor to undertake a feverish search for security in the face of the radical challenges which confront the faith, nor to fashion a theology from which political action is deduced. It is rather to let ourselves be judged by the word of the Lord, to think through our faith, to strengthen our love, and to give reason for our hope from within a commitment which seeks to become more radical, total, and efficacious. It is to reconsider the great themes of the Christian life within this radically changed perspective and with regard to new questions that are raised by this commitment." Gutierrez's words continue to reverberate across the theological landscape. The Peruvian Dominican boldly, embracingly revised the task of theology in a fundamental manner. He understood his theological purpose as one that is not mere commentary or a new theme for reflection, but rather a new way of doing theology. It is indeed the locus theologicus of all Christian theology. Hence, Gutierrez reminds us that our task here is to find the words with which to talk about God in the midst of the starvation of millions, the humiliation of races regarded as inferior, discrimination and violence against women, especially women who are poor, systematic social injustice, a persistent high rate of infant mortality, those who simply disappear or are deprived of their freedom, the sufferings of peoples who are struggling for the right to live, the exiles and the refugees, terrorism of every kind, and the corpse-filled common graves of all of our nations. This new way of doing theology is grounded in the lives, thoughts, and practices of the poor and is a response to the gift and universality of God's agapic love. This evening's Faith Forum is an offering of thanksgiving for the life and legacy of Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who died on October 27th, 2024, at the age of 96. The program comes not only in the wake of Gutierrez's homegoing, but also a time when the very foundation and future of American democracy remains intensely contested, and religion in general and Christianity in particular functions both as a panacea and as a problem that animates our most intense debates. Indeed, the tremendous challenge of the moment requires considered and critical reflection on a number of issues, including how and in what ways scholars and people of faith can and should inform and engage public life. The Wake Forest University School of Divinity's Faith Forum is our signature convening space to critically engage cutting-edge trends, topics, and pressing issues of public concern. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by several distinguished members of our faculty who will join us to explore a life of liberation, remembering Gustavo Gutierrez. First, I'd like to welcome to the stage Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo, who is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and holds the Early Chair of Catholic and Latin American Studies in the School of Divinity. An award-winning scholar and dedicated academic leader, Professor Gandolfo is a constructive theologian rooted in the Catholic tradition whose teaching and research places Christian theology in conversation with human responses to vulnerability, suffering, violence, and oppression, especially in the context of social injustice and ecological degradation. Professor Gandolfo. Michael Grigoni is a member of the faculty in the Department for the Study of Religions at Wake Forest University. He teaches courses in religion, politics, and the history of Christianity. A graduate of Harvard Divinity School and of Duke University with a PhD in religion, Professor Grigoni's research interests span the areas of religious ethics, political theology, and ethnographic theology. Professor Grigoni. Alton B. Pollard III returned to Wake Forest University in the fall of 2024 to take up the James and Marilyn Dunn Chair in the School of Divinity. He is also University Professor of African American Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. a nationally renowned scholar, author, consultant, and much sought-after speaker. Professor Pollard is President Emeritus of Louisville Presbyterian Seminary and previously served as Dean of the School of Divinity and Professor of Religion and Culture at Howard University, and served on the faculty and in academic leadership roles at Emory University and St. Olaf College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pollard. I am Corey D.B. Walker, Dean of the School of Divinity and Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and I'm going to join this conversation with our colleagues, and we'll open the conversation with some reflective remarks from each of our panelists, then engage in a public conversation on a life of liberation, remembering Gustavo Gutiérrez, and then have a brief conversation with all of us and conclude the evening with a wonderful fellowship where we can continue the conversation over some nice refreshments and beverages. Liz, we'll start with you.
All right, thank you, Dean Walker. And thank you also to Mary Foskett in the Department for the Study of Religions and Victor from Latin American Studies. Thank you for co-sponsoring this event and getting it all going. Victor emailed the morning after Gustavo's death, and I felt such a swelling in my heart of gratitude for receiving that email and acknowledging the loss and the importance of marking this incredibly important passing in the life of the church and the Theological Academy. So thank you, and thank you to my fellow panelists and all of you for being here. I love seeing familiar faces out there, students, faculty. Excited to be here with y'all. I'll just share, I'm gonna share some kind of fundamental realities that I think defined Gustavo's life and his theological contributions. I think, Dean Walker, you've already anticipated some of this in some of your remarks. But first I wanna share a little bit about how I first came into contact with Gustavo's work and liberation theology in general. I was a college student in the mid-1990s, late 1990s. And somehow, by the grace of God, I got involved in community organizing with poor people's organizations in Philadelphia, working around welfare rights. Anyone remember the late 1990s, what was happening around welfare rights? Welfare reform under the Clinton administration, right? So I was working with welfare rights organizations and a union of the homeless on housing justice. And I was going to a Catholic Jesuit university in Philadelphia. I had gone to Catholic school my whole life, had grown up Catholic, very devout Irish Catholic family. And I was in a crisis of faith because I could not understand why this tradition of my youth had nothing to say about the realities that I was encountering and the struggles that I had kind of put myself out there with as a young rebel, right? I couldn't understand why that tradition had nothing to say about poverty, injustice, or oppressive structures in society. But thankfully, again, by the grace of God, it was a Jesuit university, and I had to take 3 theology classes. And so when I got to my theology classes, I discovered some incredible riches of the Catholic tradition, including Catholic social teaching, but most especially what really captured my heart and my mind was liberation theology, introduced especially through Latin American liberation theology and the work of those pioneers like Gustavo Gutiérrez. This is a whole other side to Catholicism I'd never even heard of, and I think most Catholics have not. After some more time working in Philadelphia and then a couple years working with ecclesial-based communities in El Salvador, where liberation theology is embodied on the ground in the ecclesial-based communities, I had the immense privilege of working with Gustavo at Notre Dame, at the University of Notre Dame, when I did my Master's of Theological Studies there. I took a liberation theology class with him, and between my Jesuit education, the base communities in El Salvador, And this time at Notre Dame, I came into kind of that full richness of Latin American liberation theology as, yes, the response that was and is needed to these realities in the world, as well as other liberation theologies. Before diving into these fundamental realities that I think really defined his life, I want to share with you what it felt like to be in his presence. Because as an embodied person, Gustavo was very small in stature. Couldn't tell on the video, but he was shorter than me, and I'm 5'1". But he was a person who radiated grace and peace. Have you ever met someone like that in your life who just, there was something different, like deep within this person who they put people at ease in their presence, even though he was a prophet and a rebel and who spoke truth to power, very powerfully so. He had a presence that definitely radiated something deeper going on with him himself. I'm not sure if I'd call him a mystic. Maybe Dr. Pollard will have some insight into that, but that's who he was. He also had a sense of humor. If you got one of those little cards coming in, there's a picture of him laughing. It's my favorite picture of him out there on the internet. His sense of humor included accepting many students' comparison of him to Yoda. I personally was too afraid to share this comparison with him because I thought it would be rude. But I was graciously invited back in 2016 to Notre Dame with some of his former students, and I discovered that they all shared this with him, and in fact gave him a Yoda statue to kind of embody, solidify that kind of that connection with small in stature but incredibly powerful in spirit. So 3 fundamental realities I think that defined his life and theological contributions. The first Dean Walker referred to as God, the agapeic love of God. I think this is where that radiating of peace and spirit and power comes from. Gustavo, above all, was deeply rooted in the gratuitous love of God, the divine love for creation, for humanity. So he was theologically rooted in this. Liberation theology was often, its early critics especially, it was often critiqued for starting with experience and the poor, but I think the deeper starting point, the deeper roots for Gustavo at least, were in this experience of God's love, that gratuitousness. And I think this is a strand that runs really deep in the Catholic tradition of a sacramental imagination, an incarnational imagination, in which God is experienced in the everyday realities of human life, and in the flesh, like in the material reality. Grace is the foundation of all existence and of life itself. All existence depends on God for life, and God, this is key, God desires life for all. So he does theology out of this experience for himself of knowing this to be God. And I think that's where his humility and that openness and that spirit comes from. The second fundamental reality was the reality of material poverty, particularly in Latin America, but with a cognizance globally of what this looked like. And for Gustavo and liberation theology more generally, material poverty is not God's will, as had been taught for centuries by very traditional theologies and catechesis, that God desires the social order to be as it is. No, he prophetically denounces material poverty as a contradiction to God's will and a contradiction to the reign of God that Christians hope for and seek to co-create. Remember, God is a God of life. God desires life for all. Poverty is not life. He calls it early and unjust death. It's the result of unjust and sinful structures that human beings have created. They're not divinely ordained. This is revolutionary. 19 1970, right? 1971. This is revolutionary to say God does not will this. This is not God's will. It's the result of unjust, sinful structures, and in fact should be called idolatry. For Gustavo, he uses that religious language to name exploitation for the sake of capital accumulation and middle-class comfort and consumerism. So that's the second reality that his work is grounded in. Material poverty and the denunciation of material poverty as not God's will. The third is the struggles for liberation, particularly the struggles of those who are impoverished for liberation. So his 1979 book is called The Power of the Poor in History. So Gustavo was grounded deeply, not in the efforts of kind of the rich and powerful to give charity to or grace to the poor, but in the power of the people themselves as they struggle for liberation. At the same time, he insisted, and liberation theology makes a place for all Christians and all people of goodwill to be called to join in that struggle in solidarity, to fight against these structures of early and unjust death and to create a more just and equitable society. Gratuitousness is all about gift, right? That love, justice is gift, but it's also a task, it's a responsibility. And so this struggle for the better society, for transformation of these structures, for liberation, for freedom, and for life for everybody is that task, is that demand, really, that's placed on Christians. So ultimately, theology for Gustavo, as he's grounded in these realities, is a second act. It is not primary. We need to be really humble in that, right? In the academy, the first act of theology is the experience of and the praxis of God's gratuitous love, particularly as it's experienced in the midst of these struggles for liberation, as it's experienced in the midst of poverty, but also in the midst of fighting against those systems of early and unjust death. For him, theology is not ideas, it's not abstractions, it's not an intellectual exercise, and I think that's a real challenge to all of us in the academy. It can't be divorced from the real lives, bodies, and people who are experiencing early and unjust death. As Dean Walker introduced from the beginning of a theology of liberation, is not coming from an ideology, this theology of liberation, but from incarnate realities of suffering, of love, of justice, and ultimately of freedom. So I end with claiming Gustavo Gutiérrez to be presente here with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Professor Grigoni.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gandolfo. It's fantastic to hear you here. Thank you to Dean Walker for the invitation, and thank you to Dr. Pollard as well. It's a gift to be here. I'm really quite humbled to be sharing some reflections here, really in the shadow of a theological giant, Gustavo Gutiérrez. And I'm quite new to Wake, which also adds to the humility I'm feeling, having just joined the Department for the Study of Religions this past year. The journey to coming to Wake was a long and circuitous one, but one that was deeply shaped by my engagement with Gutierrez's writing. So I'll be sharing a bit from my own experience, and you'll hear quite a few echoes in terms of what I have to say with respect to what Liz has just shared with us. But I first encountered the work of Gutierrez while I was a master's student at Harvard Divinity School in 2008, which gives you a sense of the length of my journey. In a course titled Liberation Theology, Past, Present, and Future. And I bring this up precisely because the course was taught by the great Baptist theologian, and here we are at a Baptist Divinity School, Harvey Cox. Great professor, fantastic teacher, who in introducing Gutierrez's earth-shattering text, A Theology of Liberation, proudly shared that Gutierrez had quoted him in the book itself. The line being, the future of theology is to become a theology of the future. And that always stuck with me. It's an interesting quote, and I share it because Gutierrez draws on Cox in this portion of the text to elaborate a key claim of liberation theology, namely that the task of theology is not to sit around and read texts and reflect upon texts written centuries ago, but is rather to discern where God's liberating activity is happening in the present, and then here's the futural aspect, and to join in and contribute to the future that is emerging out of this work of liberation, which Gutierrez describes as the building of a new, just, and comradely society. So for me as a young grad student who was very wet behind the ears with all of this theology stuff, who was trying to make sense of what Christian theology should be about, here I found in Gutierrez a vision of theology that is engaged with the world, a theology that's not done from an armchair or from behind the doors of a faculty office, but is rather a theology that, quote, tries to be part of the process through which the world is transformed. And that is Gutierrez's words. Digging deeper, what is so impactful about Gutierrez is his further claim that in Scripture we find a God who makes a preferential option for the poor, and that those who seek to be Christ followers must do so as well. And further, this preferential option for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized should serve as the animating center of theological reflection. As you just heard from Dr. Gandolfo, Gutierrez was responding to the social context of Latin America in the 60s and the 70s, the economic exploitation of Latin America by the global north, and he sought in his work to highlight the role of unjust economic structures that entrap so many Latin Americans in dehumanizing poverty. And he concluded that a Christian theology that has nothing to say about these realities is not worth its salt. And so what's so powerful about Gutierrez's vision, and to echo Dean Walker earlier in terms of this being a new way of doing theology, is that Gutierrez stresses and asserts that God desires justice and liberation for the oppressed in this life, here and now, and not simply in the life to come. And that's what the language of the preferential option captures. And again, for me as a 20-something wet behind the ears master's student, here was an approach to theology that was more than an abstract intellectual exercise. Here was a theology profoundly attentive to suffering in the world. James Keenan, Catholic moral theologian, puts it quite nicely in saying that Gutierrez, quote, awakened the world to the experience and voices of the poor who had been long ignored, bringing suffering and the role of social and economic structures in perpetuating such suffering under the scope of theological ethics. And so as we gather to remember and honor Gutierrez, we do so by recognizing that he brought a sea change to the world of theology in the ways that we're describing here today, and that for many of us seeking to do Christian theology and ethics today, his work is very much a touchstone. So that's one concluding point, but I'll conclude just a bit more personally with the second point, although what I will share is I don't think very unique, but for me, I think there's a sense in which Gutierrez brings Jesus of Nazareth back into the center of theology, right? That in Gutierrez's theology, we encounter the person that we meet in the Gospels, whose ministry is to heal the sick, deliver the oppressed, and restore dignity to the marginalized. Gutierrez's theology, on my reading, takes its shape from Jesus, a person that I'm deeply compelled by and have come to love. And so I might say that I fell in love and became compelled by Gutierrez's theology because I feel that I see Jesus there. I find Jesus within Gutierrez's theology of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Professor Pollard.
Thank you, Dean Walker. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everyone. As I share my remarks, reinforcing much of what has been said, I also would like to acknowledge another ancestor that passed recently that has been of significance for me, Dr. Barbara Holmes. Barbara Holmes was the President Emerita of United Theological Seminary in Minnesota, and before that at Memphis Theological Seminary Vice President, and before that she was a lawyer and an educator and an activist and a worshipful person who spoke of joy. So I just want to acknowledge her as well. I come to Gutierrez perhaps in because at the time that his books were coming out, I was coming out too. Coming out as in going to college when he was writing, and so it has been quite a trip down memory lane to think about Gustavo Gutierrez and all that he has meant to not only the theological and ecclesial world, but to the world of all we who struggle, who yearn to breathe free. For the last half century or more, the work of theological education and witness of the Christian church has been informed by a dramatically different way of doing theology that we are talking about tonight. Liberation theology continues to inform and to be transformed by an expanding theological network of solidarity among the oppressed, partners and critics in compassion and justice that range from feminist, womanist, mujerista, decolonizing, and post-colonial theologies to theologies of technology, disability, ecology, and queerness, just to name a few. And so it is that when I think about the remarkable life of Gustavo Gutierrez, I remember from first reading his works that, as has been noted already, and which has been so indelibly a part of my own life, he never considered himself to be an academic first. It was a second and sometimes a third act for him, being with those who suffered and were oppressed, and not simply being with them, but literally walking beside them, ensuring that there could be new opportunities for their lives, is something that has always been impactful for me. He modeled what it means to navigate, for those of us who are in the academy, these intellectual spaces without ever being bound by them. He was formally educated in psychology, philosophy, theology, literature, and film, and he brought all these together in a life-affirming synergy. A Theology of Liberation was the first of his books that I read, and it came out in the same period that Jim Cohen's Black Theology of Liberation, Black Theology and Black Power, and God of the Oppressed were also occurring. His work was coming out as the same time as Vine Deloria's work and indigenous studies here in the U.S., and so there was indeed a spirit abroad on the face of the deep that was calling us all into new liberative frames of existing. Gutierrez was deeply influenced, as we have already heard, by the Second Vatican Council, and it began to take nascent shape with the work that he did with the Conference of the Latin Bishops in Medellin, Colombia in 1968. Out of that conference came a series of documents, which I used to teach about when I was here at Wake Forest back in the day. I've now returned. This is my first semester back after many years, but used to teach that course, and so important, these documents, so important, these social teachings that were coming out of the Catholic tradition, along, of course, with a myriad of other traditions that were seeking to effect change in the spirit of a living God. The bishops of Medellin called for concrete action to be taken on the part of church and state to eradicate the institutional roots of the violence that was daily brought to bear against the lives of the poor and dispossessed. And one of the signal voices in those documents is, of course, that of Gustavo Gutiérrez, a truly disruptive work that he began. His preferential option for the poor soon met backlash from his first writings from the church, from the state, national, and global concerns. It didn't seem to matter where he went. He was always being challenged because he was always willing to challenge on behalf of those who were poor and dispossessed. I have learned so much from his willingness to take on the poles and prerogatives of power, to disrupt the status quo, and to do so in their own language, in their own idiom. I was in seminary when I first read a theology of liberation, and a doctoral student when I read We Drink from Our Own Wells. His work, grounded in a radical freedom born of the experiences of the poor and suffering, impacted me deeply, and I was able to take what I learned from his writings, take what I learned from his experience, combine them with the preferential options for those who were oppressed that I had already experienced in my own milieu as a Black American whose primary years of gestation were coming of age in the 1960s. Took all of that and understood that if we do not ground ministry, if we do not ground theological understandings, and if we do not ground the life of the mind in the lives of those who are a part of our existence, then it is all for naught. He was an organizer and a consciousness raiser, and he forged that later in prophetic writing and teaching. And so it was that he did his work in situ. It was embodied. And one of the things that is often noted about him, aside from the fact that he too grew up often hungry, like those who were around him, was that he also grew up with a physical infirmity. In his teen years, he suffered from polio, and he was often bedridden or limited to a wheelchair. The intimacy of such a set of experiences enabled him, I think, even more profoundly, more deeply, to always recognize how terribly important it is to cast our lot with those who have been cast away. A theology of liberation was evocative and prophetic, a sacred call to solidarity with the insignificant ones of history. His call was part of the zeitgeist, the winds of God, the portents of change, the spirit of the age sweeping across the earth in a new historical context, signifying a new human epoch where the subject peoples of the earth were becoming radically self-aware in their struggles for freedom against those forms of injustice and oppression that had limited their daily existence, that had relegated them to disease, discrimination, despair, and an early death not of their making. The actualizing of freedom, the incessant human struggle for political and economic rights, all of this was terribly important to Gutiérrez, and yet he tells us that it is not enough. One must also be grounded in spirit. One must also be accorded the life that is immersed in the living God. And so he brings this contemplative discourse to his writings that I found particularly profound. He was always contending that the least of these, the insignificant ones, these are they who most signify and make present the presence of God. Christians are called to possess a baseline capacity, to learn to not only see the density of the current historical moment, but to see further, to look into a world of possibilities that calls us to dream dreams and see visions. But not only that, but to do so in a manner that, theologically speaking, turns the classic axes of our academic guilds on their head and invite the very rethinking of theology for us all. Among his many writings, my very favorite, I have given copies of this away, on Job, God Talk, and the Suffering of the Innocent. I have read it over and over. My own copy is dog-eared, Dean. And the books that mean the most to me are the ones that are closest to my desk. Well, this one sits on the bookcase right next to my desk. Not here, but at home. There's something about what he writes there, where he calls all of those who consider themselves to be the interpreters of social inequality. He calls them to task for blaming the oppressed for their own condition. Theological narratives have been part of the empirical concerns and conditions of our world for as long as I can remember. In hegemonic society, material causes are mythologically transformed into subjective causes and marketed then back to the rest of us. They are marketed so effectively that many of us begin to internalize our own oppression, not recognizing that the Spirit of the living God enables us to have a profoundly different view of the world. But because of the effectiveness of this marketing, those who are often in the seats of the powerful have found a way to absolve themselves, so they think, of any culpability in the condition of the poor. The book of Job presents the question of culpability in theological fashion, as we know in the friends' explanations to Job of why he is suffering. As in all of his books, Gutiérrez asks in this one, how can we tell the poor that God loves them? And how are we to do theology while suffering lasts? Like Job, Gutiérrez rejects any facile causal understandings of God's relationship to us. In faith, God cannot be reduced to human understanding. In faith, God is not constrained by our metrics of morality or our expectations of rewards and punishment. These are not easy words to hear or to consider, but this was his faith. Liberation theology for Gutiérrez moves from the single sufferer, as popularized by the phrase, why do bad things happen to good people? He moves us beyond that to the historical collective sufferings of the poor. How are we to preach the love of God amid such profound contempt for life in our world? And then again, justice alone does not have the final say about how we are to speak of God. Job then, in the biblical text, is brought face to face with his own actions concerning the poor. Gutiérrez writes that Job's response, now that he shares life himself with the poor, is to go out of himself and help other sufferers without waiting until his own problems are first resolved. This is to find a way to God, according to the needs of every time then, and of every place. Gutiérrez would say to us, I believe that our calling is to journey with God's people who suffer. Thank you.
Liz, Michael, and Alton, thank you so much for those reflections on Gustavo Gutiérrez. Those personal reflections, those reflections on practices brings us back to that first moment where we opened with the film of Gustavo talking around the planetary. And it is the bang dung imagination of post-World War II. It is the non-aligned movement, the Asian African Summit, the desire to have a global Christian bang dung, How do we begin to wrestle with the planetary dimensions of Gutierrez's intellectual vision and practice then and now?
For me, Gutierrez is quite straightforward. He understood that this is not the language he would use, but in the academy it is the language that I would use. He understood that there was an unfolding understanding of God's witness in the world, that the suffering of the poor was not only extended to the human community, but to all of creation. And we were the ones who were now culpable for what was taking place. That calls us then, it requires us to take action on behalf of a poor and suffering earth, not only a poor and suffering humanity.
That word planetary sends me right to the ecological, I think, where Alton also went. And early and unjust death, Gustavo was primarily speaking of material poverty of human beings. That was, even to the end, really his main focus. He would include other forms of oppression sometimes in a list of also this, also this, also this, but material poverty as causing early and unjust deaths was really central for him. But I think his methodology and that central reality of early and unjust death, it means that this theology has to be planetary, because early and unjust death is what happens when you exploit not only human beings for capital accumulation and consumer comfort and all of that, but the earth itself is also being disemboweled and exploited and brought to early and unjust death in ecosystems and biodiversity loss and mass extinctions, and in climate crisis, climate chaos, which in turn then brings more early and unjust death to more people, especially those who are most vulnerable and suffering already in conditions of impoverishment. So the implications have to be planetary. And I think that's, Alton, the way you started with all the many different theologies that kind of spring from these early figures of liberation theology, like Gustavo Gutierrez, like James Cone. They are taking those implications and making them global in feminist, womanist, mujerista theologies, in eco-theologies, in queer theologies, all of those global theologies that are more and more intersectional in their analysis are taking the implications of these early liberation theologies and critiquing them and carrying them to kind of a more just conclusion. Yeah.
And I might add to that, it's worth noting that in many ways, Catholic social ethics and the tradition of Catholic social teaching, particularly with the authoring of Laudato Si by Pope Francis, which calls for the care of creation and calls attention to the ways in which human activity is destroying the natural world, is in many ways, as has been expressed, a way of extending the preferential option to the natural world, to creation. And in many ways, we are catching up to Gutierrez's insight there. And it's no surprise that this encyclical Laudato Si was authored by the first pope from the global south, from Argentina, from Latin America. We can't understand Laudato Si without reference to kind of the ground clearing or path breaking that Gutierrez enacted first. He paved the way for this. So I think that's important.
To continue on the theme of the planetary, if the planetary becomes the theological horizon for doing theology in a fundamental way, Gutierrez also practices a planetary conversation. These are with partners, of course, Vatican II and Medellin. But when he references Bang Dong, when he references and thinks through what happens when a theology of liberation is published, and of course Cone's is a Black theology of liberation and God of the Oppressed are published, and 67 is 68 is Black theology, Black power, but they're translated into English and Spanish respectively in 1973. There is a conversation going on. The Theology in the Americas project in the mid-70s and throughout the late 70s in Detroit. The class that he and James Cone taught at Union in 1977, Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. It seems that with that broader theological vision, he had a broader set of conversational partners. And in many ways, that planetary dimension of the conversation sort of has withered and atrophied. Can you speak to us a bit about the dexterity to maintain those planetary conversations, to feed the theological imagination over and over and over again?
You're a tough question asker, Dean Walker. It's hard work. And I guess that's part of what's the difficulty of responding to your question, because I don't know, where I've seen it in action very well. The World Social Forum may be one place where there's also conversations around liberation theology adjacent to that on a global level. But I think most of us in the Theological Academy aren't plugged into that, and maybe don't pay much attention to what's going on beyond the U.S. or the North Atlantic world. And so there's an I think there can be an insularity to what we do. And so I think the dexterity has to come from a deep understanding of how interconnected we are as a species and as a planet, and how interconnected the systems and structures of oppression are here in the United States with those systems and structures of oppression globally. So, means of production and consumption, where, the production of the goods that we buy in, the grocery stores or in, Walmart or in TJ Maxx, where those things come from. But also where the interconnections are in terms of the oppressive systems that work internally to the United States, have been globalized from the United States in the imperial reach of the U.S. and our economic system. So I think there's a start, maybe, to that difficult question. That it's not just that oppressions everywhere have something in common. It's that they are interrelated. And I didn't exactly articulate that, as a political scientist might, I don't know, maybe somebody out there in the crowd might have something to say to that. But I think that's a place to start.
I don't have much to say to this, but I would say, having attended ETWAD conferences in the distant, years, I was always struck by how difficult it was for those theologians, those scholars, those clerics, to make it to those meetings just for the sheer reason of economics. Empire has a way of picking you off. And even though there was a profound commitment on the part of these people of magnificent mind and spirit to do this work, the simple heavy lift of coming to a meeting often needing to, in fact, find host countries to sponsor them because they could not afford to get there on their own. Many of them were not coming out of conditions of wealth, such as we. And so, I mean, those were very grounded recognitions that I think forestalled the growth, the continuation of ETWIDE. On the other hand, I do think that we still see iterations of it in the World Council of Churches, where there are resources, material, which almost contradicts. It's quite the paradox that we live in. Yeah. Speaking truth to capital.
Hey, Michael.
Well, really briefly, I mean, what's really interesting in terms of the academic associations I'm a part of is there's kind of a emerging discernment around the question of the carbon emissions involved in hosting these meetings and actually moving people physically from all over the country into one city to foster theological exchange, right? And so there are the possibilities being floated that we would meet virtually every 3 years or something like that. So my hope is that as we move ahead and become more and more conscious of the costs of having in-person meetings, that perhaps this will open up possibilities for broader planetary exchange, the kinds that you are hoping that liberation theology calls for and requires.
We talk a lot about not only the planetary horizon and that fuels the vision, the theological imagination, as well as those critical conversations. But what grounds Gustavo Gutierrez's vision is his faith. It grows out of his Christian commitment. When we look at the state of global Christianity now, matter of fact, we just had a wonderful report come out of Brazil. Brazil will be, in a few years, the first become majority Protestant from being Catholic, and it's the second exporter of missionaries, second only to the United States. How do we begin to think of the ways in which the Christianity that Gustavo talks about and cultivates within his theological imagination, and the ways in which Christianity is changing on the ground throughout the global South and even in the North Atlantic world? How do we begin to wrestle with those changes and complexities of the face of Christianity and this vision of a continual conversation around liberation theology?
Okay, well, so I have a really hard time just thinking like big global trends and where do I land in all of that? And I think I have to land in what is the cultivation of very particular local Christian communities for whom the gospel of liberation is the central commitment and reality. And so what our students are doing and are about to do as they go out into the world, I think, is where it can and should be happening. So if theology is grounded in that, it has to be connected to those very specific local expressions of a liberating faith. So, Iglesia Cristiana Sin Fronteras, Pastor Daniel Sostaita, aquí in the front row, is a place where that is happening as one example, and I know there are others, and you all know of others. So I kind of despair when I think at the global level of things, and I get really anxious. And so I had to connect with that local feet on the ground theology that is happening in local communities. Right now, there's in El Salvador, there is an encuentro happening of the local communities. So there are ecclesial-based communities all over Latin America, local expressions of what you're talking about. Theologians are not connected to them. They're not doing the work of being there and speaking out of that experience. It's a network of people from the ground up who are doing that work of liberating faith. And they're connecting with one another. And I think it's happening here in our context as well, as I mentioned, and as I think you all know from your own local community connections here in North Carolina, but also around the country. And so the more we can connect from the theological academy with those local expressions, I think the more we're actually carrying out the legacy of what liberation theology is about.
I don't want us to give the impression that the local and the global are either or. That's the crux of the question. That an either or logic, we don't live either or lives. And if we started off by talking about the interconnection and interrelatedness of oppressions and their planetary dimensions, that we cannot disentangle the local from these global processes. And this is Gustavo's vision. That's where he starts out with Bang Dung. And now we have to do a Catholic Bang Dung, a Christian one, but that doesn't erase the local. But what it does is elevate the vision to understand its planetary dimensions.
So let me ask you, Dean Walker, as as the dean of the Divinity School here in Winston-Salem, how do you think about this question? If it's okay for me to ask, in terms of the issues and concerns and the work of liberation that's happening here in Winston-Salem, how do you think about connecting with that liberating activity and then using it as a springboard to think in this more planetary, global way? How would you answer?
I would probably begin with 1973. I was 2 in 73, but I'll begin there as if I lived there. 73 becomes the year where a Black theology of liberation is translated into Spanish and a theology of liberation is translated into English. And the question becomes, why does that happen? And how does that happen so early? And of course, there are always networks operative. And the interesting thing about the Bang Dung moment that Gustavo points to is that it is the moment of Nyere, Nasser, and Nkrumah. That when it was hard to move globally, and we have always been globally oriented, folks were moving and recognized that our local actions had global reverberations. And so what we have to do here in Winston-Salem is a unique space because Winston-Salem is the home of the largest chapter of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, started by Marcus Garvey in the early part of the 20th century. Then that moves to the Black freedom struggle here in Winston that grounds the Black Panther Party, when the first chapter of the Black Panther Party in the South is in Winston-Salem. But that is also connected with a vision of anti-apartheid and Mady Hall Zuma, who was part of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa in the 1940s. She graduated from Winston-Salem State in 1937. So when I think of Winston-Salem, I cannot disentangle Winston from a larger global vision. When I think of the transformations in North Carolina politics and demography, I cannot help but think of the ways in which agriculture and agribusiness have transformed farming, and of course, then it looks for new labor. And Leon Fink's book, The Maya of Morganton, is one of the first labor histories that looks at the ways in which these transnational circuits of labor operate. And when these transnational circuits of labor operate, they transform local communities. So I cannot think of the transformation of Waughtown outside of the transformations of global capital and the ways in which local communities come in. And of course, that creates political pressures, both locally and nationally, and operate internationally. So in a moment where we see the global mobilization of religious fundamentalisms, Christianity in the the global South and in the global North, the ways in which Hindu nationalism operates in India, the ways in which certain forms of fundamentalist Islam operate across the world. We have to nurture and curate that global imagination that is dialogical in the ways in which it engages the global and how it is refracted at the local. It is not one or the other. It is a style and modality of thinking that Gustavo Gutiérrez and the folks in liberation theology had an exemplary practice of doing. They would never overlook those base ecclesial communities, but at the same time, they are connected to a broader world. And so the beauty and the tragedy of us as scholars, as theologians in the academy, is that our task becomes that task of elaborating that modality of thinking. That it does not just stop with what Gustavo did. The reason he continued to come and teach in Notre Dame, at Boston College, at Union Theological with James Cone, is a practice of, and notice what I say, a practice of intellectual life that constantly moves dialogically between these poles, geopolitically, cognitively, intellectually, and most important, spiritually. Hopefully we do that at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And that's our goal of theological education.
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic as you are, Dean Walker. Part of the reason why I went the direction of the social sciences as opposed to the theological was precisely because of my own discontent with what I saw going on in the Guild. We were writing significant tomes. We were thinking eloquently and expounding in sophisticated ways, but at a disjunction with the people, not on the ground, distant and removed. And the word ivory tower applies to us as much as it does to any other discipline in higher education. And so for me, this has always been a reason to make sure that in my own life and witness, that one is never lost at or gained at the expense of the other. But when I think about the many academic conferences I've gone to, and especially in more recent years, the distance seems to be growing. It's not merely the gap of material wealth. It is also the gap of intellectual wealth and the gap of spiritual wealth. All of these forms have continued, it seems to me, to be exacerbated. And how seriously are we going to take those kinds of wrestlings, I think is very much a part of the work of the academy as anything else. And that's That was one of the reasons why I was so excited about what I saw happening at Wake Divinity School, PSA, because this seems to be a place where we want to take on those kinds of difficult questions and concerns, and having taken them on, to act, not just to take them on, but to actually be engaged in praxis too.
Look at everyone out here. Folks, we can continue this conversation all night. But as one thing we do with conversations is they're risk-filled endeavors, because conversations present the opportunity to be changed and transformed. So we invite you now, if we have any questions to pose to our esteemed guests about, and reflections about, what is the meaning of this moment of liberation theology when we're seeing the eclipse of a generation. And it is really this founding generation that is now moving away from the scene. Do we have any questions? I have a question right here. We're going to bring you a microphone.
Hey, Francisco Gallegos. I teach philosophy here at Wake Forest, and Dean Walker, your remarks made me think about how nice it would be to think about ways of connecting to both of those poles, both getting in the churches, actually connecting outside of the ivory tower and in with the people where they're doing battle with their spiritual questions, and also at the global level, having conferences where you're talking with people from other continents. I mean, it's rare, actually, for me now in the academy to do either one of those things. It's so isolated. And just so, I just want to reflect back to you this invitation, and I was just thinking about conferences. They suck, but one thing that would be so nice, when it's hard to come, you have to stay with people, and you have to stay for a long time and share meals, and you get to know each other, and you have to help in all kinds of physical ways. I'm just thinking about ways that the academy can use our resources to facilitate genuine, humanizing, possibility-filled, resource-filled connections at both of those scales. And I don't have anything specific to say. I just wanted to reflect back to you what you just said, and to say that was really moving, and I want to take that into my own discipline as well, and see if anybody else had any thoughts about that.
I'll say something, because I have an example of this. That was, the resources are, we were talking about, we can't believe there are resources, and we can use them. It's so exciting. A small grant from a Humanities Institute can fund something like what I pulled together in 2019, where what you're describing was far more what it was like, sharing life together, and not just going and being around other academics in the guild. So a colleague of mine, a co-author of mine, and I got a humanities grant to fund an independent study with 5 students, undergrads and graduate students, from the Divinity School and from the Department for the Study of Religions, to bring them together with 5 folks from these ecclesial-based communities in El Salvador to sit together for a few days. The students left after a little bit, and then it was me and my co-author and our 5 colleagues from El Salvador, where we just sat together and ate food and shared some presentations with one another, but also brought musical instruments and sat around a fire and shared just a few days of being human together that resulted, in the percolation of really fruitful ideas that then get translated, into further work in the academic sphere, but also cross-fertilization, where our friends went back to El Salvador, with some energy around some certain things and some ideas for future projects and ways of thinking about things. So it's like an example, and it was only a little tiny Humanities Institute grant. Imagine pulling much greater resources around creating those kinds of experiences. And I know that's probably not the only one. Mike, I won't call out anyone in the crowd because I'm thinking of someone in particular, but there are other experiences where students and practitioners and other theological thinkers are having these transformative experiences of being together that aren't in the really horrible academic conferences that you're describing.
Digital.
And digital as well, yeah.
But also, I think about rare experience I've had that I think would be so welcome in our communities if we took our educational experiences off campus into those communities and shared our insights with them, but invited them into the conversation, not as audience participants alone, but in the same way that you just spoken of. So I just think we do have a lot of opportunities to do it, and looking forward to what we do here.
And also to make sure that we don't practice or process an epistemicide. We don't want to kill those knowledges, and there are also other knowledges there. And this is where I think we talk institutionally of going into the community, but we have yet to get rid of the baggage of epistemic imperialism that operates within the academy and within our disciplinary forms and formations. Because this is what Gustavo challenges us toward, to move to a different epistemic framework and formation. That it is, if knowledge is created in community and in collaboration, perhaps the practices of knowledge production and reproduction in the academy must now change. That's a bigger, and that's what we control.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, that's what we control. Have one more question, or a question right here? Yeah.
I'm Santiago. I work also with a couple of churches in the community of faith. I'm here because Gustavo Gutiérrez, one of the things that I learned back in the years in college was that the methodology I used in my projects was coming from Paul Freire. When I was reading Paul Freire, I realized that Gustavo Gutiérrez was a big collaborator with him in something I think probably your question about changing, liberating the education. And one of the things that stuck with me was that invited me, the project I had to do, my professor told me, no, it should be in the marginalized place. So we had to develop a project there. And that project changed, I'm talking about 4 years ago, that changed my perspective of serving the community. And that was traveling with me to this country, coming to the USA. But one of the things that I think is very valuable is that we have to continue training, liberating training. And liberating training is also doing some projects with purpose in some marginalized places, not just in our context where we work, but also when we do mission trip. That is good, but how we can continue that work we do. And that is the goal of Gustavo Gutiérrez. Challenge you in not doing and liberating exodus for your life for one time, but continue that process of liberating yourself, suffering in your long-term life while you are here on earth. So my question is for the new ministers that probably pastors or leaders we are going to have here in this faculty, how do you see the continued training or liberating the church in the future for them? How? 50% of the ministers that get into the ministry, they left the ministry. Statistic, but how do you plan to nurturing that?
How do we transform ministry for the church? Liberative ministry that then liberates the church and liberates the clergy.
Sir, that's the question of the ages. It's the work that we have been, that I know that the School of Divinity here is wrestling with, seeking to be about. It is also doing so with the recognition that there are yet and still so many of us who come to this work not with necessarily a heart for the people, or not necessarily with the least of these as a part of our own preparation as scholars, but we are coming also into an engagement in the academy where many of our students are focused more so on credentialing, and how to broker that can be a very difficult thing. I absolutely believe in modeling what we teach. In our day and time, that has become, I think, ever more difficult when we look at what has happened to so many churches in our own society here who have abdicated any kind of accountability for those who would be deemed the least of these. And we've done it in the name of power, and we've done it in the name of nationalism. And so some of the forums and the conferences that the School of Divinity are working to put together in these right now in this year, and that have been a part of, I think, the classroom experience here, are just small building blocks. But we have to, even at the end of the day, beyond that, really demonstrate that we practice what we teach. And this is so terribly, terribly important. This is a question I could talk about for a long time, because the wrestlings have been great by so many theological institutions, and so many have floundered. That's the beauty of what I see here, because Wake Divinity School is not floundering, in my estimation, having been to so many different environments. And if we start surely, and if we start certainly with the belief that the life and the mind and the life of the spirit are inextricably bound, if we come with that kind of a perspective, then it is going to take us into those arenas of the lives of people who are dispossessed, knowing that we cannot be defeated. But you have to have both of those walking together, and it's not something that we always find in our guild. Of course, we also don't find it in the church enough. So the work that Dean Walker talked about earlier, and not losing our epistemic way, we have to do it, and we have to do it more. And I appreciate that question. But that is the question.
Yeah, I think, Santiago, what you're asking about points towards the need for a fundamental transformation in the way we think about and form students for religious leadership.
the old models, whether they're Catholic or Protestant, I'm coming from the Catholic tradition, are very hierarchical. I mean, even in many Protestant churches, I've learned a lot since being here, there's a clericalism that places the ordained pastor at the top of a hierarchy. He usually knows everything, teaches everything, commits the epistemic violence that Dean Walker was referring to. And so I think what we are about, that I think Alton is referring to, is working with students to decenter themselves in their ministry, to, of course, come into themselves, come into their voice, but to also recognize that every other person in their ministry has a voice. As Paulo Freire would have taught, the way we work with people is listening and dialogue and learning from one another. And so I think that's kind of the work of transforming religious leadership from that top-down model, which is very hierarchical, patriarchal, and white supremacist, to something that's much more organic and relational and reciprocal in other religious and faith communities.
Closing thoughts. On this particular question, I live in the world of undergraduate life currently, so I am not thinking about this question as much. But I perhaps would just say that I mean, I think what comes to mind for me is there's been a turn to the use of ethnography among Christian theologians and theological ethicists, and perhaps drawing from that methodology and the ways in which ethnography facilitates a being with persons in their everyday lives and everyday contexts could perhaps be another methodology that could be of assistance in Divinity School training of ministers, modes of listening, modes of being with, that could perhaps be incorporated and assist with respect to this question that's being raised here. So I could leave you with that at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we want to thank each of our conversationalists, Alton, Pollard, Michael Grigoni, Elizabeth Gandolfo. And we want to thank you for not only engaging this conversation, but also, in a sense, bearing witness to a testimony that did not leave in October of this year, but one that continues to live on in the work that we all have taken up in our respective ways and in our respective paths. We opened up with a statement from the first page of Gustavo Gutierrez's classic, A Theology of Liberation. And we'll close with that classic statement as well. Our purpose is not to elaborate an ideology to justify postures already taken, nor to undertake a feverish search for security in the face of the radical challenges which confront the faith, nor to fashion a theology from which political action is deduced. It is rather to let ourselves be judged by the word of the Lord, to think through our faith, to strengthen our love, and to give reason for our hope from within a commitment which seeks to become more radical, total, and efficacious. It is to reconsider the great themes of the Christian life within this radically changed perspective and with regard to the new questions posed by this commitment. Let us thank Gustavo Gutierrez for the gift of his life, the gift of his vision, and the gift of his spirit. Amen.